Hello everybody, it's Walter, your favorite historian, educator, professor, and social studies extraordinaire, here today to educate you about the D.C. Compensated Emancipation Act of 1862. If you have never heard this landmark federal law, that's okay. That's why we're here. Sit back, relax, and prepare to be enlightened. So as a result of the American Civil War and the lack of Southern representatives in the U.S. Congress, slavery would not only be abolished in Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, but compensation would be given to the former owners of that lost slave property. On the 16th of April, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed into law the D.C. Compensated Emancipation Act. Under its terms, emancipation was immediately granted to all slaves in the District of Columbia, as well as up to $300 in compensation would be provided to former slaveholders, who were loyal to the Union, of course, for each freed slave. That doesn't automatically mean they receive $300 for each lost slave, but up to $300 for each lost slave. All right? Additionally, each former slave who chose to voluntarily leave the United States and resettle somewhere like Haiti or Liberia would be given $100 apiece. All right? Now, a board of commissioners was appointed to administer this great act, which ultimately approved some 930 petitions, completely or in part, from former slaveholders seeking restitution for their lost slave property. Okay? Under the act, some 3,185 people ultimately received their freedom. And over the next 9 months, nearly all of the $1 million appropriated by Congress for the act's implementation had been spent. All right? So back to the $100 for each black person who chose to leave the U.S. With their emancipation. An additional $100 had been appropriated along with the $1 million for that purpose. All right. Needless to say, most African Americans did not choose to leave their homeland for places far off else in the world, such as Haiti or Liberia, that they had no knowledge of and frankly had no desire to go to. All right. Even if they would be in the majority racially in the population. All right. So there are several facets of this law which deserve special attention, all right? First, this is the only time in American history where the U.S. government directly compensated individuals for the loss of slave property with public money, all right? In this case, due to forced emancipation. All further compensation for the loss of slave property by either the federal government or the state governments was specifically banned by Section 4 of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The 14th Amendment was, of course, ratified in July of 1868. Okay? Number two, this is the very first and essentially the only federal law ever enacted by Congress which directly abolished slavery where it existed by positive law in any U.S. jurisdiction. All right. Keep in mind, the federal government's power at this time was very limited, folks, and it really didn't have power to affect slavery anywhere but in federally owned land, such as D.C. or the territories. All right. And this would be the very first which directly abolished slavery anywhere in the U.S. All right. Under its jurisdiction and under its complete control, where it had the power to do so. The first and only congressional enactment to do so. All right. Laws that were enacted against slavery in the territories were more vague, as slavery was typically not established there by positive law, but in the district it was and had been sanctioned for many years. All right. So this is very landmark for that purpose. All right. As the District of Columbia was and remains a direct federal enclave, Congress may exercise its authority over D.C. anytime it wishes, regardless of the desire of D.C.'s local government, the mayor and city council. All right. So Congress directly exercised its plenary authority over D.C. here and abolished slavery forever in the district. All right. So slavery, of course, while this was a first step, slavery would be eradicated in all forms in the United States of America, completely, entirely, and in perpetuity by the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which came into effect in December of 1865. All right. Third, this act was passed by Congress and signed into law by Lincoln some 9 months before he would issue his famous Emancipation Proclamation, which of course proclaimed the freedom of all enslaved people in parts of this nation that were still under Confederate control. Keep in mind, the Emancipation Proclamation, though noble in its intent, specifically exempted several places from its reach, most notably the border states such as Maryland and Delaware and Kentucky and Missouri, all right, as well as parts of the Union and the Confederacy, that had been recaptured by the Union, all right, most notably places in Louisiana, all right. So the Emancipation Proclamation, of course, declared that as of January 1st, 1863, all slaves would be thenceforth and forever free. All right. Of course, with those exceptions that I just mentioned to you. All right. Again, all slavery was completely eradicated in its entirety with the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution ratified in December of 1865. But the D.C. Compensated Emancipation Act, as well as the Emancipation Proclamation, were certainly great moves in that direction before the 13th Amendment was ratified. All right. So, fourth, the D.C. Compensated Emancipation Act was a singular act whose direct manumission and offered colonization of black people outside America obviously did not provide a precedent for future acts of manumission, regardless of whether they were at the state or federal level. Nonetheless, it was the first official act by the U.S. Congress during the American Civil War, which direct action was taken against slavery, all right, toward manumission of any enslaved population in the United States, all right? And of course, as we know, with the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, the D.C. Compensation Emancipation Act provided the precedent, essentially, in that regard for these future actions against slavery, all right? Where the D.C. Compensated Emancipation Act did not provide the precedent was for colonization of blacks outside the U.S. or compensation. The only precedent it provided was emancipation. All right. Lastly, I would like to add that the most unique feature of the act was that of compensated emancipation. All right. And while that might not seem like such a big thing, I'll explain why. Okay. So in the United States of America, compensated emancipation for lost slave property was rarer than a white buffalo. All right. Under normal circumstances, slaves who were lost as spoils of war or who escaped from their owners or were forcibly manumitted by the government were typically just taken at a loss, all right, by the owner, all right? To put it more colloquially, they were SOL, all right? There was no monetary or otherwise compensation for their lost slave property. So that's why you see why so many slave owners went through such great pains to capture runaways in the 19th century in the United States. So the D.C. Compensated Emancipation Act was a significant break to that tradition, all right, in providing compensation for that lost slave property. And most view it today as essential for getting the act through Congress, even with the Southern representatives not being there, all right? So thankfully, it's the only one on record on the part of the federal government where public money was spent to compensate former slaveholders for their lost slave property. All right. So, and the act itself was the realization of a many decade long struggle by abolitionists to eradicate the sin and stain of slavery from our nation's capital. All right. So April 16th has been celebrated in the District of Columbia as Emancipation Day since 1866. But it was not made an official public holiday in the district until 2005. Just thought you'd like to know that, it took the district a very long time to formally codify this landmark day into an official public holiday, something to definitely remember and just to see how far we've come and still how far we have to go. So again, April 16th in the District of Columbia is celebrated as Emancipation Day.